Some secrets in history were never forgotten. They were buried. Not lost. Not erased completely. Just pushed deep enough into the past, where no one would think to look again. Because sometimes, the truth isn't dangerous because it's unknown. It's dangerous because it was once known, and then deliberately hidden. And the deeper you go into history, the more you begin to realize that not everything we've been taught was meant to tell the full story. Some parts were softened, some parts were simplified, and some parts were removed entirely. Not because they didn't matter, but because they mattered too much. From the moment we first learn about history, it feels structured, clean, organized into timelines that make sense. Events follow one another in a way that feels logical, almost inevitable. But real history doesn't move like that. Real history is chaotic, unpredictable, full of contradictions and moments that don't fit into neat explanations. And yet, what we're taught rarely reflects that chaos. Instead, we're given a version that feels controlled, a version where everything has a clear beginning, a clear middle, and a clear end. But that kind of clarity doesn't come naturally. It has to be created. And when something is created like that, it raises a question. What had to be removed to make it look so complete? Because history isn't just a collection of facts. It's a narrative, a story shaped by those who record it, interpret it, and pass it on. And every story involves choices. What to include, what to emphasize, what to leave out. These choices aren't always obvious. Sometimes they happen gradually, over time, as details are condensed, simplified, and retold. But over generations, those small changes can transform the story itself, turning something complex into something simple, turning something disturbing into something acceptable. There are events in history that feel familiar, stories you've heard so many times. They no longer feel like stories at all. They feel like truth, fixed, certain, beyond question. But familiarity can be misleading, because the more something is repeated, the less we tend to examine it. And that's exactly where the first cracks begin to appear. Small details that don't quite align, moments that seem too convenient, explanations that feel complete, but only if you don't look too closely. Because when you do look closer, something changes. The story doesn't fall apart, it expands. And in that expansion, you begin to see what was missing. Not in obvious ways, not like a hidden document suddenly revealing everything, but in subtle inconsistencies. Gaps in the narrative, questions that don't have clear answers. And once you notice those gaps, they become impossible to ignore, because they suggest something deeper, something that exists beneath the surface of the story we were told. There are records, scattered, incomplete, that hint at these deeper layers. Accounts that don't fully match the official version. Details that were acknowledged at one point, but slowly faded over time. Not erased in a dramatic way, but reduced, minimized, until they became almost invisible. And when enough of those details disappear, what remains feels simpler than it actually was. But simplicity can be misleading, because the truth is rarely simple. There are moments in history where the official explanation feels too perfect, too clean, as if everything unfolded exactly the way it was supposed to. But real events, especially the ones that shape entire societies, don't happen that neatly. They involve uncertainty, conflicting interests, decisions made under pressure, sometimes in ways that don't make sense until much later. And yet, those complexities are often removed from the version we're taught. Why? Because complexity raises questions, and questions can be uncomfortable. They challenge certainty. They force us to reconsider what we think we know. And in some cases, they reveal truths that are difficult to accept. So instead of confronting that complexity, it's often simplified, reduced to something easier to understand, easier to teach, easier to believe. But easier doesn't always mean accurate. Because when you simplify something enough, you don't just make it clearer, you change it. And that change can hide things, important things. There are stories within history that don't follow the expected pattern. Stories where the outcome doesn't match the explanation, where the actions of individuals don't fully align with the results that followed. And in many cases, those inconsistencies are overlooked. Not because they aren't there, but because they don't fit the narrative. And when something doesn't fit the narrative, it tends to dissipate. Not completely, just enough that most people never notice it's missing. And that's what makes this first secret so disturbing. It's not about discovering something entirely new. It's about realizing that something familiar isn't as complete as it seems. Because once you begin to question one part of the story, it leads to another, and then another, until eventually, you're no longer looking at history as a fixed record of the past. You're looking at it as something more fluid, more complex, something that has been shaped over time, in ways that aren't always visible. And that realization changes everything, because it means that what we understand about the past is based on a version of events that may not include everything that actually happened. And if that's true, then the question isn't just what we know, it's what we don't know. Because absence doesn't feel like absence when you're not aware of it. It feels like completeness. And that illusion of completeness is what keeps the deeper layers hidden. There are moments, quiet, almost invisible moments, where decisions were made that never became part of the official story. Conversations that influenced outcomes, actions that shaped events. But because they weren't documented in a way that made them easy to include, they remained on the edges. And over time, those edges faded, until the story became something else. Something simpler. Something that could be told without raising too many questions. But the truth never fully disappeared. It remained in fragments, in details that didn't quite fit, in records that were never fully explored, and in the quiet realization that something was missing. And that's where the unease begins. Not in the idea that history is false, but in the possibility that it's incomplete. Because incompleteness means there are parts we haven't seen, parts that could change how we understand everything. And once that possibility exists, it can't be ignored. Because the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. Why certain details are emphasized, while others are barely mentioned. Why some stories are told repeatedly, while others are rarely discussed. Why certain outcomes feel inevitable, even when the path leading to them was anything but clay. Because inevitability is often a product of how a story is told, not how it actually happened. And that distinction matters, because it shapes how we see the world, how we interpret events, how we understand cause and effect. And if that understanding is based on a version of history that has been simplified, then our perspective is simplified too. We begin to accept things as they are, without questioning how they came to be. We see patterns, without recognizing what created them. We believe in certainty, without noticing the gaps. And those gaps are where the real story exists. But finding that story isn't easy, because it requires you to look beyond what you've been taught, to question what feels familiar, to accept that some answers may not be clear, and that uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it's also necessary, because without it, nothing changes, nothing is re-examined, nothing is discovered, and the narrative remains exactly as it is, stable, predictable, incomplete. But once you step outside that stability, even for a moment, everything starts to look different, because now, you're not just seeing the story, you're seeing the structure behind it, the choices that shaped it, the details that were included, and the ones that were left behind. And that awareness is where everything begins to shift. Because the moment you realize that history isn't just about what happened, but about what was chosen to be remembered, you begin to see it for what it really is. Not a perfect record, but a constructed narrative. One that contains truth, but not always the whole truth. But the first secret isn't completely hidden. It's something you've heard before, just not in the way it actually happened. And once you hear the real version, you won't see it the same way again. There's a moment in history that almost everyone recognizes. It's been taught in classrooms, repeated in documentaries, written into textbooks so many times. It no longer feels like a story. It feels like fact. Solid. Unquestionable. A turning point that shaped everything that came after. But what if that moment wasn't what it seemed? Because the version most people know is only the surface. A simplified sequence of events. A clear cause. A predictable outcome. Something that feels logical, even inevitable. But the deeper you look, the more that clarity begins to fade. And in its place, something far more unsettling begins to emerge. The official story tells you how it started, what triggered it, who was responsible, and how it unfolded. But it doesn't tell you everything. It doesn't explain why certain decisions were made so quickly, or why some details don't fully align with the timeline we're given. It doesn't explore the inconsistencies that were noticed early on, but never fully investigated. And it definitely doesn't mention the questions that were quietly raised, and then just as quietly ignored. Because from the very beginning, Something didn't add up. At first, it was small, easy to dismiss. Minor details that seemed insignificant compared to the scale of what had happened. But those details didn't dissipate. They remained, scattered across records, reports, and personal accounts. And over time, they began to form a pattern, not an obvious one, not something that could be easily pointed to and explained, but something consistent enough to raise doubt. Because when multiple details fail to align with the official narrative, it suggests that the narrative itself may not be complete. And incompleteness changes everything. There were witnesses whose accounts didn't fully match what was later recorded. Observations that contradicted key parts of the story. Timelines that felt compressed, as if events had been arranged to fit a specific sequence rather than reflect what actually happened. Individually, these inconsistencies could be explained. Memory is unreliable. Details get confused. People see things differently. But when those inconsistencies appear again, and again, and again, they stop feeling random. They start to feel connected. And that connection leads to a possibility that most people never consider. What if the event didn't unfold the way we were told? Because the deeper investigation didn't happen publicly. It didn't become part of mainstream understanding. Instead, it remained in fragments. Pieces of information that existed, but were never fully assembled into a single, coherent picture. And that's where the real story begins. Not in what was presented, but in what was left out. There were reports, early, unpolished, unfiltered, that painted a slightly different version of events. Versions that included details later removed. Observations that didn't fit the narrative that eventually became accepted. And while those reports were never completely erased, they were gradually pushed aside, replaced, refined, simplified, until what remained was something easier to understand. Something that made sense. Something that didn't raise too many questions. But the original fragments were still there, waiting to be noticed. Because truth doesn't always dissipate. Sometimes, it just becomes harder to see. And when researchers, those who look beyond the surface, began revisiting these fragments, they didn't find a completely different story. They found something more disturbing. A story that was almost the same, but not quite. A version where the outcome remained unchanged, but the path leading to it felt different. Less spontaneous, less chaotic, more structured, more controlled. And that difference is everything. Because if an event that appears sudden actually followed a pattern that existed beforehand, then it wasn't entirely unexpected. And if it wasn't entirely unexpected, then someone, somewhere, may have seen it coming. Or worse, allowed it to happen. That idea isn't easy to accept, because it challenges the way we understand cause and effect. It suggests that what we see as reaction may not always be reaction. That what feels like chaos may contain elements of control. Not complete control. Not something obvious or easily proven, but enough influence to shape the direction things would take. And that kind of influence is difficult to detect, because it doesn't leave clear evidence. It exists in patterns, in decisions that seem logical on their own, but reveal something else when viewed together, in actions taken before the event that only make sense afterward. And once you start to see those patterns, they become impossible to ignore, because they raise a question that changes everything. Was the event truly what it appeared to be? Or was it the visible result of something that had already been set in motion? There are moments, brief, almost overlooked, where this possibility becomes clearer. Decisions made just before the event that don't fully align with the situation at the time. Preparations that seem unnecessary, unless something was already anticipated. Reactions that feel too immediate, too precise, as if they were expected. And while none of these details prove anything on their own, together, they create doubt. And doubt is powerful, because it opens the door to alternative explanations. Not wild theories, not unfounded speculation, but reasonable questions. Questions that deserve answers, but rarely receive them, because answering those questions would require revisiting the narrative, re-examining the details, admitting that the story may not be as complete as it seems. And that kind of admission is difficult, because it doesn't just change one event. It changes everything connected to it. The decisions that followed, the consequences that unfolded, the way history remembers that moment. Because if the beginning is different, then everything that comes after it has to be reconsidered. And that's exactly why this first secret remains hidden. Not because it's impossible to find, but because it's difficult to accept, because it challenges something that feels certain, something that has been taught for generations, repeated without question, accepted without hesitation. And once something reaches that level of acceptance, it becomes part of reality. Something people don't think to question. But the moment you do question it, even slightly, everything starts to shift, because now, you're not just looking at the event. You're looking at the gaps around it, the details that don't quite fit, the fragments that were never fully explored. And in those fragments, you begin to see something else. Not a completely different truth, but a deeper one. A more complex version of events. One that doesn't fit neatly into a textbook. One that raises more questions than answers. And one that forces you to reconsider what you thought you knew. Because the most disturbing part of this secret isn't that the story is wrong. It's that it might not be complete. And incompleteness leaves room for something else. Something hidden. Something that was never meant to be fully understood. But if one of the most well-known events in history can have hidden layers that were quietly ignored, then the next secret is even darker. Because this time, it's not about what was changed. It's about people who were completely erased, as if they never existed at all. History remembers the loudest voices, the leaders, the victors, the names that are repeated over and over until they become permanent. But it rarely remembers the quiet ones, the ones who stood behind the scenes, the ones who built, contributed, sacrificed, and then disappeared. Not physically, but historically. Because sometimes, people don't just fade away with time. They are removed. Carefully. Quietly. So completely, that future generations grow up without ever knowing they existed. And that's what makes this secret so disturbing. Because it's not about something hidden in a distant archive. It's about people, real people, whose stories were taken out of history as if they never mattered. At first, the idea seems unlikely. How can entire contributions, entire lives, simply vanish from something as vast as history? But when you look closer, you begin to realize that history isn't a perfect record. It's a selection, a version, and selection means exclusion. Because every time a story is told, something else is left out. And sometimes, what's left out is more important than what remains. There are individuals whose work laid the foundation for discoveries that would later be credited to others. People who spent years, sometimes their entire lives, developing ideas, solving problems, contributing to progress in ways that were essential, but never fully recognized. Their names appeared in early records, mentioned briefly, acknowledged in passing. But over time, those mentions became smaller, less frequent, until eventually, they disappeared. Replaced by a simpler version of the story. One that focused on a single name, a single figure, a version that was easier to remember, easier to teach, easier to celebrate, but not entirely accurate. Because real progress is rarely the result of one person. It's built on layers of effort, multiple contributions, countless individuals working together, often without recognition. And when those layers are removed, the story changes. It becomes something cleaner, more focused, but also less true. And this isn't just about forgotten individuals. In some cases, entire groups were erased. Communities whose contributions shaped major developments, but whose presence was minimized or ignored completely. Their work remained. Their impact visible, but their identities gone. And that kind of erasure doesn't happen by accident. Because forgetting one person might be coincidence. Forgetting many is a pattern. A pattern that suggests something deliberate, something controlled. Because including those people would have complicated the narrative. It would have challenged the idea of singular achievement. It would have raised questions about how recognition is assigned. And most importantly, it would have shifted power. Because history isn't just about the past. It influences the present. The names we remember become symbols. They represent success, achievement, authority. And when those symbols are limited, so is our understanding of who matters, who contributes, who gets remembered, and who doesn't. There are documents, old, fragile, often overlooked, that still carry traces of these erased stories. Letters that mention names no longer found in official records. Notes that reference contributions that were never fully acknowledged. Accounts that tell a slightly different version of events, one where more people were involved, where credit was shared, where the story was more complex. But those documents were never widely distributed. never emphasized, never turned into the version of history that most people would learn. And over time, they became background noise, something that existed, but wasn't heard. Because recognition isn't just about existence. It's about visibility. And visibility can be controlled. There are moments where this control becomes visible. Subtle shifts in how a story is told. Early versions that include multiple names. Later versions that focus on one. Descriptions that once acknowledged collaboration. Gradually changing into narratives of individual brilliance. And those shifts don't happen all at once. They happen slowly, quietly, over time, until the original version becomes difficult to find, and the new version feels complete. But completeness can be misleading, because when something feels complete, we stop looking for what's missing. And that's exactly how erasure works. Not by removing everything at once, but by reducing visibility, step by step, until the absence no longer feels like absence. It feels normal, expected, unquestioned. And that's what makes it so effective. Because once something becomes normal, it stops being challenged. But the truth doesn't dissipate. It remains in fragments, in scattered references, in details that don't quite align with the simplified narrative. And when those fragments are brought together, they reveal something unsettling. Not a completely different history, but a deeper one. A version where more people were involved, where contributions were shared, where the story was more complex than what we were told. And that complexity is where the injustice becomes clear. Because erasing someone from history doesn't just take away recognition. It changes reality. It reshapes how events are understood. It alters the perception of who mattered and who didn't. And that has consequences, not just for the past, but for the present. Because the way we understand history influences how we see the world today. It shapes expectations. It defines what success looks like. It determines whose voices are heard and whose are overlooked. And if that understanding is based on incomplete information, then those expectations are incomplete too. We begin to believe that impact requires visibility, that recognition defines importance, that if someone isn't remembered, they didn't matter. But that belief is not always true, because some of the most important contributions in history came from people whose names were never preserved, whose stories were never fully told, whose presence was quietly removed to maintain a simpler narrative. And once you realize that, everything changes. Because now, you're not just looking at what history shows you. You're thinking about what it doesn't. The names that were never mentioned, the contributions that were never highlighted, the voices that were never heard. And that awareness is powerful, because it reveals a side of history that is rarely discussed. A side that is more complex, more uncomfortable, but also more real. Because real history isn't just about what was recorded. It's about what was chosen to be recorded, and what was chosen to be left out. And that choice shapes everything. Because when you control the narrative, you control perception. You define what people believe about the past, and by extension, what they believe about the present. And that's why this secret matters. Because it's not just about forgotten names. It's about understanding that absence doesn't mean insignificance. That silence doesn't mean lack of impact. And that sometimes, the most important parts of a story are the ones that were never told. But erasing people wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was why it was done. Because the next secret reveals a decision that was never meant to be discovered. And the consequences of that decision are still unfolding today. Some of the most powerful moments in history don't look powerful at all. They don't happen in front of crowds. They don't make headlines. They don't feel like turning points. Instead, they happen quietly, behind closed doors, in rooms that were never meant to be remembered. Because real power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides. And the decision you're about to understand was one of those moments. At the time, it didn't seem important. It wasn't presented as something that would change the course of history. There were no immediate consequences, no visible reaction, no sense that anything unusual had taken place. And that's exactly what made it so dangerous. Because when something doesn't feel significant, it doesn't attract attention. It doesn't get questioned. It doesn't get examined. It simply passes, becoming part of the background. And that's where it stays, until its effects begin to appear. Slowly, subtly, over time. Because this wasn't a decision designed to create instant change. It was designed to shape the future, to influence outcomes without appearing to control them, to create conditions where certain possibilities became more likely and others quietly disappeared. And once that kind of structure is in place, it doesn't need constant control. It runs on its own, guiding events, shaping patterns, influencing decisions that come long after the original moment has been forgotten. And that's what makes this so difficult to detect, because by the time the impact becomes visible, the cause is already gone, hidden in the past, disconnected from the outcomes it created. There are fragments of evidence, not enough to form a complete picture, but enough to suggest that something happened. Documents that reference discussions, without explaining their purpose. Records that show decisions being made, without revealing the reasoning behind them. Moments where the direction of events shifts, without a clear explanation. And those fragments don't make sense on their own. But when you begin to connect them, a pattern starts to emerge. Not a clear one. Not something that can be easily proven, but something consistent. Something that suggests intention. Because the changes that followed this decision weren't random. They followed a direction, a subtle alignment that becomes more visible over time. Policies that began to reflect a certain structure, actions that moved in a specific way. Outcomes that, on the surface, seemed unrelated, but shared the same underlying pattern. And that pattern leads back to this moment. This quiet decision, made without attention, without scrutiny, without the awareness of those who would later be affected by it. And that raises a question that is difficult to ignore. Was this just coincidence? Or was it something more? Because coincidence can explain isolated events. But patterns suggest design. And design implies purpose. Not always a clear one. Not always something that can be fully understood. But enough to change how you see what came next. Because once you consider the possibility that this decision shaped future outcomes, you start to look at history differently. Events that once felt separate begin to feel connected. Decisions that seemed reactive begin to feel preconditioned. Outcomes that appeared inevitable begin to feel influenced. And that shift is unsettling because it challenges the idea that history unfolds naturally, that events happen as a result of clear, visible causes, that outcomes are simply the product of circumstance. But if hidden decisions exist, then the story isn't that simple. Because now, you have to consider the possibility that some outcomes were shaped long before they appeared to happen. Not controlled completely. Not in a way that removes uncertainty. But influenced enough to guide direction. And that kind of influence is powerful. Because it doesn't rely on force. It relies on structure. On creating a framework within which events unfold. And once that framework is in place, everything that happens inside it is affected, even if the people involved aren't aware of it. And that's what makes this decision so disturbing. Because it didn't just affect one event. It affected everything that came after. In ways that are not always visible, but are always present. There are moments, small, almost invisible moments, where this influence becomes clearer. Decisions made later, that seem logical on their own, but align perfectly with the structure created earlier. Actions taken by different people, in different contexts, that move in the same direction. And when those moments begin to connect, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Because now, it's not just a possibility. It's a presence. Something that exists beneath the surface of events, shaping them, guiding them, without being seen. And that realization changes everything. Because it means that history isn't just a series of events. It's a system, a network of decisions, influences, and structures that interact over time. Some visible, some hidden, but all connected. And when one of those hidden elements is powerful enough, it can shape the entire system. And that's exactly what happened here. The decision didn't remain isolated. It became embedded, part of the structure itself. And once something becomes part of the structure, it stops being recognized as a decision. It becomes normal, expected, unquestioned. And that's when it becomes most effective. Because now, it doesn't need to be hidden. It's simply accepted. But acceptance doesn't mean understanding. And that's where the danger lies. Because when something is accepted without being fully understood, it can continue to influence outcomes, without being challenged, without being questioned, without being noticed. And that's exactly what has happened. The effects of this decision didn't end. They continued. They evolved. They adapted to new circumstances. but the underlying structure remained the same. And that means something important. Whatever was set in motion back then is still active, still shaping the way events unfold, still influencing the direction of things, even today. Not in a way that is obvious, not in a way that can be easily pointed out, but in patterns, in tendencies, in the subtle consistency of how things happen. And once you begin to see those patterns, you realize something unsettling. This wasn't just a moment in history. It was the beginning of something that never really ended. But if a single hidden decision could quietly shape the course of history for decades, maybe even centuries, then the final secret is the most disturbing of all. Because this time, it's not about the past anymore. It's about something that is still happening, right now. And you might already be a part of it. Some things in history don't stay in history. They don't end when the event is over. They don't disappear when the records are closed. They continue, quietly, unnoticed, becoming part of the world we live in, without ever being recognized for what they really are. And that is what makes this final truth the most disturbing of all. Because this isn't about something that happened long ago. This is about something that never actually stopped. By now, you've seen the pattern. Events that weren't fully explained. People who were quietly erased. Decisions made in silence that shaped everything that came after. At first, these seem like isolated moments. Separate. Unconnected. But they are not. They are pieces of something larger. A structure. A system. One that didn't appear overnight. One that wasn't built in a single moment. But one that was formed gradually. Through choices, omissions, and influences that accumulated over time. And once that system was in place, it didn't need to be controlled directly anymore. Because systems don't rely on constant input. They rely on design. On the way they are built. On the rules, spoken or unspoken, that define how things operate within them. And those rules can outlast the people who created them. They can continue for generations, shaping behavior, guiding decisions, defining what is considered normal and what is not. And once something becomes normal, it becomes invisible. Because people don't question what feels natural. They don't examine what appears to have always existed. They accept it, without realizing that it may have been created, intentionally, long before they were even aware of it. And that's the point where influence becomes most powerful. Not when it is obvious, but when it is unseen. Because when something is unseen, it cannot be challenged. And when it cannot be challenged, it continues, uninterrupted. There are patterns in the present that mirror the past. Ways in which information is structured. Ways in which certain narratives are emphasized, while others are barely mentioned. Ways in which attention is directed and redirected, without most people ever noticing. At first, these patterns seem natural, coincidental, the result of practical decisions. But when you begin to compare them to the structures that existed in the past, something becomes clear. They are not entirely new. They are extensions, evolved versions of the same underlying framework. And that framework is what connects everything. Because it was never about a single event or a single decision. It was about creating a way of operating. A system that could sustain itself without needing to be constantly maintained. A system where influence becomes embedded. Where control doesn't look like control. Where direction feels like coincidence. And once that system exists, it doesn't need to hide. Because it's no longer visible. It becomes part of reality. Part of the way things are. And that's what makes it so difficult to recognize. Because you're not looking at something separate from your world. You're looking at something that is part of it, something that shapes it. Something that defines it. In ways that are not always obvious. There are moments, small, subtle moments, where this becomes visible. Where something doesn't quite align. Where the explanation given doesn't fully match what you're seeing. Where the narrative feels complete, but something about it feels off. And most of the time, those moments are ignored, dismissed, because questioning them would require stepping outside the system, looking at it from a different perspective. And that's not easy, because the system doesn't just exist around you. It exists within you, in the assumptions you make, in the expectations you have, in the way you interpret information. And stepping outside of that means questioning not just what you've been told, but how you've been taught to think. And that is uncomfortable, but it's also necessary. Because without that step, nothing changes, nothing is re-examined, nothing is understood at a deeper level, and the system continues, exactly as it is, unchallenged, unseen. But once you begin to question it, even slightly, everything starts to shift. Because now, you're not just accepting information. You're analyzing it. You're looking for patterns. You're noticing inconsistencies. You're asking questions that don't have simple answers. And those questions lead somewhere, not to a single, clear truth, but to a realization that changes how you see everything. That what we experience as reality is shaped, not entirely controlled, not completely defined, but influenced by structures that were created over time. And some of those structures were never fully revealed, because if they were, they would raise too many questions. They would challenge too many assumptions. They would disrupt the sense of stability that people rely on. And stability is powerful because it creates comfort, and comfort discourages doubt. But doubt is where awareness begins, and awareness is what this entire journey has been leading to. Not to a final answer, not to a complete understanding, but to the recognition that there's more beneath the surface than we are usually aware of. That history is not just something that happened. It's something that continues to influence what happens. That the past is not separate from the present. It is part of it. And that realization is what makes this final truth so difficult to ignore. Because it doesn't just change how you see history. It changes how you see everything. The systems you live within. The information you consume. The narratives you accept. It makes you aware that there may be layers you haven't seen. Details you haven't considered. Influences you haven't recognized. And once you become aware of those possibilities, you can't go back. Because now, every story feels slightly different. Every explanation feels slightly incomplete. Every certainty feels less certain. And that uncertainty is not weakness, it's awareness. Because it means you're no longer just accepting things as they are. You're questioning them, exploring them, trying to understand them at a deeper level. And that is where real understanding begins. Not in what is shown, but in what is discovered. And sometimes, what is discovered is not a clear answer, but a deeper question. One that stays with you. One that changes how you think. One that doesn't go away. Because it's not about the past anymore. It's about the present. It's about the possibility that what you're experiencing right now is part of something larger. Something shaped long before you were aware of it. Something that continues to operate, quietly, consistently, in the background. And that realization is what makes this the most unsettling truth of all. Because it means this story isn't over. Because if the darkest parts of history were never truly erased, only hidden, and if those hidden structures still shape the world we live in today, then the real question isn't what happened back then, it's what is still happening now, right in front of us, that we haven't learned to see yet. In the end, history doesn't just tell us what happened, it tells us what survived. Because not everything that happens becomes history. Some parts are recorded, some parts are remembered, and some parts are quietly removed before anyone even realizes they existed. But removal doesn't erase reality, it only erases awareness. And that difference is everything. Because throughout this journey, you've seen something unsettling. Events that weren't as simple as they appeared. Stories that felt complete, but weren't. People who contributed, but were never remembered. Decisions made in silence that shaped entire generations. And a system that didn't just exist in the past, but continued, evolved, adapted, until it became part of the world we live in today. And that's what makes this realization so powerful. Because it changes how you see everything. It forces you to step back and question something most people never think about. What if the version of history we know is only one layer of a much deeper truth? Because once you start asking that question, you begin to notice things. Small inconsistencies. Gaps in familiar stories. Moments where the explanation feels complete, but something about it doesn't fully align. And slowly, the past begins to feel different. Not false, but incomplete. And incompleteness leaves space for something else. Something hidden. Something that was never meant to be fully understood. Because the most effective way to hide something isn't to erase it completely. It's to leave just enough visible that no one thinks to question what's missing. And that's exactly what makes history so complex. It doesn't lie directly. It simplifies. It organizes. It presents a version that feels stable, understandable, believable. But beneath that stability, there are layers, unseen details, unanswered questions, and influences that never truly disappeared. They just became harder to recognize, because over time, they blended into the system, into the way information is presented, into the way stories are told, into the way people understand the world around them. And once something becomes part of the system, it stops looking like influence. It starts looking like reality. And that's where it becomes most powerful. Because now, it doesn't need to be hidden. It's simply accepted. But acceptance is not the same as understanding. And that's the line most people never cross. Because understanding requires effort. It requires doubt. It requires the willingness to question things that feel certain. And certainty is comfortable. It gives the illusion of clarity, of control, of knowing exactly how things are. But once you step outside that certainty, even slightly, everything begins to shift. Because now, you're not just seeing the story. You're seeing the structure behind it, the decisions that shaped it, the details that were included, and the ones that were left behind. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Because now every story carries a question. Every explanation carries a possibility. Every fact carries a layer you haven't fully explored. And that doesn't make the world more confusing. It makes it more real. Because reality isn't always simple. It isn't always clear. And it isn't always fully visible. Sometimes, it exists just beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be questioned, waiting for someone to look a little deeper. And maybe, that's the real purpose of all of this. Not to give you answers, but to change the way you think. To shift you from passive acceptance to active awareness. Because once you become aware, you start seeing patterns. You start asking better questions. You start recognizing that what you're told isn't always the full picture. And that awareness is powerful. Because it means you're no longer just consuming information. You're analyzing it. You're understanding it. You're looking beyond it. And that's where real knowledge begins. Not in what is shown, but in what is discovered. And sometimes, what you discover isn't a hidden fact. It's a hidden pattern. A way of seeing the world that reveals how much more there is beneath the surface. And once you realize that, everything changes. Because now, history isn't just something you learn. It's something you question. Something you explore. Something you understand, in layers. And those layers don't just belong to the past. They exist in the present. Right now. In the systems you interact with. In the information you consume. In the stories you believe. Which leads to the most important question of all. If the darkest parts of history were never truly erased, only hidden, then how much of what we see today is shaped by things we were never meant to notice? Because the truth was never completely buried. It was simply left, just out of sight.